The night Clover Maddox saved a man's life, she didn't do it out of courage. She did it because she'd been invisible her whole life, and invisible people notice everything. It was a Thursday, which mattered because Thursdays at Maison Dorval were the slow nights, the night when the kitchen staff argued about hockey and the floor manager disappeared into the back office with a bottle of Beaujolais. Clover had been working the dinner shift at Maison Dorval for 3 years. 3 years of squeezing between tightly packed tables that were never quite designed for a woman her size. 3 years of customers who spoke their orders to the wall behind her head rather than to her face. 3 years of perfecting the art of becoming part of the furniture. She was 26 years old, 5'4", and somewhere north of 260 pounds depending on the week. She had dark red hair. She kept twisted up under her cap, freckles across her nose, and hands that were always slightly chapped from the industrial sanitizer they used on the glassware. She wasn't the kind of woman people wrote poems about. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 12 years old, and a boy in her class in Sudbury had announced it to the entire cafeteria. But she had eyes. Good ones. The man who came in that Thursday with 6 others wasn't a regular. Clover knew every regular, knew their drink orders, their food allergies, their divorce stories. These men were different. They moved through the room the way weather moves in off Georgian Bay. You feel it before you see it, and by the time you see it, you're already soaked. The one in the center was the one who mattered. She could tell by the way the others positioned themselves around him, never blocking his sightlines, never turning their backs to the room. He was tall, lean, and somewhere past 40, with grey at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved to make a point. He wore a dark suit that hadn't come off a rack. He sat with his back to the wall and his face to the door. His name, she would learn later, was Lucien Archambault. She didn't know that name then. She didn't know what it meant in certain parts of Montreal, what doors it opened, what people it buried. She only knew that when the hostess seated him at table 9, the corner table, the best in the house, every other server on the floor suddenly remembered they had something urgent to do on the other side of the restaurant. So Clover went. She took their drink orders without making eye contact with anyone in particular, scribbled them down in her notepad the way she always did. Not because she needed the notes, but because it made people more comfortable when they thought she was writing things down, rather than just watching them. She brought out the first round without incident. The men talked in the low, unhurried way of people who never needed to raise their voices to be heard. She was on her way back to the bar for the second round when she noticed the whiskey. It was sitting at the end of the bar, already poured, on a small tray that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. A glass of Lot 40. She could tell by the color, the way it caught the light. That was what Lucien Archambault had ordered. She knew because she'd written it down, even though she'd had no intention of forgetting it. She stopped. She looked at the glass. Then she looked at the bar, at Dennis the bartender who was at the other end drying pint glasses, and she thought, Dennis didn't pour that. Dennis was right-handed and always left the bottle on the right side of the tray. This bottle had been placed on the left. It was a small thing, a nothing thing. The kind of detail that meant everything if you were the kind of person who noticed details, and meant nothing at all if you weren't. Clover stood there for 4 seconds. She counted. And then she picked up the tray, walked it straight to the kitchen, and poured the whiskey down the drain while the dishwasher wasn't looking. She filled a fresh glass herself, from a bottle she pulled off the shelf, sealed until 30 seconds ago. She brought it to the table. She set it in front of Lucien Archambault and she was already turning to go when he said, quietly, "Wait." She stopped. He was looking at the glass, not at her. One of the men to his right shifted slightly in his seat, another one across the table. Younger, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth set in permanent suspicion, was already looking at her the way people look at something they're trying to decide how to categorize. "This isn't what I ordered," Lucien said. "It's the same," Clover said. "Lot 40, neat, different bottle." Silence. The table was very still. It was the kind of still that Clover would later reflect probably preceded a lot of unpleasant things in Lucien Archambault's line of work. He looked up at her then, for the first time. Really looked, the way people almost never looked at Clover Maddox. Why a different bottle? He said. It wasn't quite a question. She considered lying. She was good at lying. Not the dramatic kind, but the small, practical kind that got you through customer service without incident. But something about the way he was looking at her made the lie feel beside the point. Someone poured that first glass while Dennis's back was turned, she said. I don't know who. I didn't think you'd want to drink it. Another silence. Longer this time. The young man with the sharp cheekbones leaned forward. She's saying someone tried to. I know what she's saying, Felix. Lucien hadn't looked away from Clover. Did you see who poured it? No, I just saw that Dennis didn't. He picked up the new glass. He held it for a moment, turned it once in his hand, and then he set it back down without drinking. He looked at her the way you look at a door you weren't expecting to find unlocked. Sit down, he said. I'm working. I'm aware. Sit down. She sat. There was an empty chair at the end of the table. She suspected it hadn't been empty by accident, and she pulled it out and sat in it with her notepad still in her hand, because she didn't know what else to do with it. The other men said nothing. Whatever was in Lucien Archambault's face kept them quiet. You could have said nothing, he said. You could have brought the glass and walked away. In your position, that would have been the sensible thing. Probably, she agreed. So why didn't you? She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking about it, because she found she wasn't entirely sure. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't calculation. It was something more instinctive than either of those things, something she'd carried with her since Sudbury, since the cafeteria, since every room she'd ever walked into and been looked through like glass. I don't know, she said. It seemed wrong to let something happen that I could stop, even to someone like me. She looked at him steadily. I don't know what someone like you means. You're a person who came in and ordered a whiskey. I'm a person whose job is to bring it. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the general territory. What's your name? He said. Clover. He said it once, quietly, as though testing the weight of it. Then he nodded once and looked at Felice. Whatever passed between them in that look, Clover wasn't meant to understand it. But the atmosphere at the table changed. The tension that had been coiling itself tighter for the past 4 minutes began, slowly, to unknot. You can go back to work, Lucien said. She went. She brought out the rest of the round without incident. She served 2 other tables. She rolled cutlery at the service station and thought about what had just happened with the detached, methodical part of her brain that she usually reserved for working out bus schedules and grocery budgets. She decided eventually that it was over. That it was a strange thing that had happened once and would not happen again. She was wrong about that. Over the next 3 weeks, Lucien Archambault came back to Maison Dorval 4 times. Always on a weeknight. Always with different configurations of the same handful of men, always table 9. And always she noticed this immediately. Because she noticed everything, he was seated in her section. She served him without fuss. She didn't pretend the first night hadn't happened, but she didn't make a production of it either. She brought his lot 40, always from a sealed bottle she opened herself, and she never mentioned this, and neither did he. He tipped well. Not extravagantly, not performatively, just correctly, the way someone tips when they understand the value of things. On his 4th visit, he came alone. Just him and Felix, who sat 2 tables away and divided his attention between the door and his phone with the joyless efficiency of a man who had given up hoping for a more interesting career. Lucien ordered his whiskey, his steak, and then, when Clover brought the 2nd round, he said, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, she said. Before that, Tim Hortons. Before that, filing for an insurance company. Before that, a grocery store. He nodded slowly. You grew up in Ontario. It wasn't a guess. She didn't ask how he knew. Sudbury, she said. You came to Montreal for work, she said. There wasn't much in Sudbury. He looked at her in that measuring way he had. The way that she'd learned was not unkind. Even if it wasn't warm exactly. The way you look at something when you're trying to understand what it actually is, rather than what you assumed it would be. Do you like this work? He said. She thought about it honestly. I like being good at something, she said. I'm good at this. That's not the same as liking it. No, she agreed. It's not. He drank his whiskey. She went back to her other tables. She thought, walking home that night along St. Denis with the March cold coming up off the pavement, that he was a strange man. Not strange the way dangerous people were often strange. Not erratic. Not performatively unpredictable. Strange in the way that genuinely solitary people are strange, utterly self-contained, and quietly curious about everything outside themselves. She did not think about the fact that he was handsome. She was very careful not to think about that. The trouble started on a Tuesday, 4 weeks after the first night. She heard it before she understood it. A shift in the restaurant's ambient noise, a subtle recalibration. The way a flock of birds would change direction half a second before the hawk is visible. She looked up from the table she was clearing and saw that 2 men had come in through the side entrance, not the front. The side, through the kitchen corridor, which was not a public entrance. They were heading for table 9. Lucien was there with 3 of his men. Felix, a quiet older man called Armand who always ordered the lamb, and a 3rd man she didn't know. Heavyset, late 30s, who'd been introduced to her once as Renaud. Except that wasn't right. The name in the file. The name she'd overheard once in passing. She caught herself. It didn't matter. What mattered was the 2 men coming through the wrong door, moving with the hurried, committed energy of people who had made a decision and were past the point of reconsidering it. Clover was standing 6 feet from table 9. She was holding a bus tray with 4 empty glasses on it. She was, in the estimation of every person in that room, invisible. One of the men coming through the side door had his right hand in his jacket pocket, in a way that Dennis the bartender's hands were never in his jacket pocket. She moved. She didn't decide to move so much as her body made the decision and brought her along for it. She cut across the room at an angle, walking quickly, naturally, just a server in a hurry. And she walked directly into the path of the first man, not fast enough to look intentional, not slow enough to be coincidence, just the right speed for an accident. The bus tray caught him square in the chest. Glasses fell, made an extraordinary amount of noise. Every head in the restaurant turned. Lucien's 3 men were on their feet before the first glass hit the floor. What happened in the next 40 seconds was something Clover did not watch, because she was crouched on the ground collecting broken glass with the focused attention of a woman who was absolutely not doing anything except cleaning up her own mess. By the time she stood up, the 2 men from the side door were gone. Felix's jaw was set at an angle that suggested the evening had been educational for everyone involved, and Lucien was standing 3 feet away looking at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. I dropped a tray. Clover. She looked up at him. Something in his voice was different, stripped of the careful, considering quality it usually had. More direct, more human somehow. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very clumsy. Ask anyone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "No, you're not." He left 30 minutes later. The tip he left was not a normal tip. She stared at it, then looked at Dennis, who looked back at her with an expression that suggested he had chosen to know absolutely nothing about anything that had happened that night. She did not sleep well. The next morning, a car was parked outside her building on Dorval Street at 7 a.m. Not threatening, just present. Feli was in the passenger seat. He got out when she came down the front steps and handed her a card. No name on it, just a number. "He wants to talk," Felix said. "I have a shift at 11, she said. "After," Felix said, and got back in the car. She turned the card over in her hands on the metro ride to work. She thought about all the sensible reasons not to call the number. She thought about her apartment, her lease, the fact that she'd been saving up for a second-hand sewing machine she'd seen on Marketplace. She thought about Sudbury, about being 12, about all the years of walking into rooms and becoming part of the walls. She called the number at 4:15, standing outside the restaurant with her coat on. He answered on the second ring. "I need to understand something," he said without preamble. "Twice now, you've done something that was not your job. not your problem, something you could have walked away from. And both times you were in a position to do it because no one in that room was paying any attention to you. She waited. Is that something you're aware of, he said, the not being paid attention to? I've been aware of it since I was 12, she said. A pause, and you decided to use it. I decided to stop being bothered by it, she said. Using it was just what came naturally after that. Another pause, longer. The kind of pause that felt like recalculation. I have a proposition, he said, one that would require you to continue not being paid attention to in a more formalized context. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold April air and listened. She thought about the sewing machine. She thought about the bus schedule. She thought about Lucien Arcambault's voice, which was not quite like any voice she'd heard before, not because of its quality, but because of how it treated her, which was the same way it treated everything, as a thing worth accurately understanding. What would it pay, she said. He told her. She was quiet for a long moment. I still have to give 2 weeks' notice, she said. I'm not leaving Dennis short-staffed. Another pause. Then, unmistakably, the sound of a man who rarely laughed making a small sound that was adjacent to laughter. 2 weeks, he said. Yes, that's fine. She worked out her 2 weeks. On her last night, Dennis gave her a card signed by the whole kitchen staff and a bottle of wine, and she cried a little in the walk-in cooler where no one could see. She was going to miss Maison Dorval more than she'd expected. She'd been good there in the quiet way she was good at things. She showed up to her new position without entirely knowing what her new position was, which she suspected was by design. What she discovered over the following weeks was that Lucien had told her the truth. Her job was to not be noticed, to be present in rooms as a neutral object, a function, a wallpaper, and to remember everything she saw and heard and to tell it to him accurately and without editorializing, and he would do with it whatever he did with information. She was extraordinarily good at it. She was good at it in the way she'd always been good at the quiet things, the way she could read a room when she walked in, could tell from the angle of a person's shoulders whether they were comfortable or performing comfort, could catch a lie to detail the way other people caught obvious mistakes. She had spent 26 years being underestimated, which meant she had spent 26 years watching, because watching was the one thing no one could take from her. She reported. He listened. He asked questions that were always precise and never leading, and she learned from the shape of his questions what he was looking for, and she learned to find it before he had to ask. They worked like that for 6 weeks. And then the problem with Renaud became impossible to ignore. She had noticed it first in the 3rd week. Something slightly off in Renaud's manner when certain names were mentioned. A 1-second lag in his expressions that didn't match the room. She said nothing, because she was still new and still learning the geography of what she was allowed to say, but she kept watching. She kept filing the details away in the careful, comprehensive way she'd been filing details her whole life. By week 6, she had enough. She was in Lucien's office, a room she'd been in exactly 4 times, which was spare and very clean and smelled of coffee and paperwork, when she said, I need to tell you something about Renaud. He looked up from what he was reading. I think he's been telling someone where you're going to be, she said, before you're there. I think that's how those men knew to come in through the side door that Tuesday. I think someone told them your schedule. Silence. That's a significant thing to think, he said. I know. She had her notebook out. She went through it, dates, details, specific observations, the small particular facts that accumulated into a weight that was hard to argue with. She'd been systematic about it, because that was the only way she knew how to be. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He said. I wanted to be sure, she said. I didn't want to tell you something I couldn't support. He looked at her. Most people, he said slowly, would have come to me the moment they suspected, to demonstrate their loyalty, to look useful. I didn't need to look useful, she said. I needed to be right. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, because nothing in Lucien Archambault's face ever shifted dramatically, but there, a small recalibration, the door moving on its hinge. "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." He dealt with Renaud in ways she didn't ask about, and he didn't describe. What she knew was that within 48 hours, the atmosphere in the building changed. A collective exhale, a loosening of something that had been wound too tight for too long. What she didn't expect was what happened 2 days after that, when Lucien called his people together. Félix, Armand, 2 others she'd learned the names of, a handful more. And she was in the back of the room, which was where she always was, occupying her usual role as the furniture, when Lucien said her name. She looked up. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room. She was aware, as she always was when she was asked to cross rooms, of the way she moved, of the space she occupied, of the eyes that tracked her and the assessments those eyes made. She had spent 26 years being aware of all of it. She had stopped letting it land. She stood in front of him. He turned to the room. "This is Clover Maddox," he said. "For the past 6 weeks, she's been the most valuable person in this organization." She identified the source of the Tuesday incident. She identified Renaud before any of us did. A pause. She has also, on 2 separate occasions, prevented significant harm to this organization, and to me specifically, while everyone else in the room was looking elsewhere. The room was quiet. "She's not the furniture anymore," he said, and he said it clearly, the way you say things you intend to have heard. "She's one of us. Treat her accordingly." Clover stood very still. She was not going to cry. She was categorically not going to cry in front of 7 men in an organized crime organization. She focused on a fixed point on the wall and breathed. Félix, she noticed, was nodding slowly, with the expression of someone whose long-held private opinion had finally been made public policy. Lucien didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with the same direct, assessing attention he gave to everything worth understanding. It was, she had come to realize, the way he showed respect, by paying attention without flinching. "You have questions," he said, lower now, just to her. "Several," she said, "but they can wait." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Good. Because I have something I need you to see in Rosemont tomorrow morning, and I'd rather not send anyone else." "What time?" she said. 7:30. "I'll be there," she said. She walked back to her place at the edge of the room. She sat down. She opened her notebook. Around her, the meeting resumed, the low, efficient conversation of men conducting the difficult business of power. And Clover Maddox picked up her pen and began to write. Because there was always more to notice, always more to record, always one more detail that everyone else was too busy to see. She had been invisible her whole life. It turned out that was exactly enough. I keep coming back to that moment at the bar. Clover standing there holding a tray, staring at a glass of whiskey that almost nobody else in that room would have looked at twice. 4 seconds, she counted. 4 seconds between noticing something was wrong and deciding to do something about it. Most people would have talked themselves out of it in that time. Most people would have thought, "It's not my table, not my problem, not my place." But that's the thing about integrity. It doesn't wait for the right moment or the right audience. It shows up in empty hallways and slow Thursday nights when nobody's watching and nobody would know the difference either way. Clover didn't act because someone would reward her for it. She acted because she'd already decided, somewhere long before that night, what kind of person she was going to be. That decision was already made. The moment just asked her to prove it. What strikes me most is what she chose to do with the way the world had treated her. She'd spent years being overlooked, not occasionally, not by accident, but systematically, the way certain people get trained by their environment to expect nothing and receive nothing and eventually stop expecting anything at all. She could have become bitter about it. A lot of people do, and honestly, who could blame them? Instead, she got quiet. She got sharp. She learned to read rooms the way other people read books, because when no one talks to you, you start to really listen. That's not luck. That's a particular kind of intelligence that only develops when you stop waiting for permission to use your mind. Clover wasn't book smart in the way that gets noticed in school or praised in interviews. She was observant in the way that keeps people alive, tracking the small wrong detail, the bottle on the left instead of the right, the hand in the jacket pocket at the wrong angle. She had been building that skill for 26 years without knowing it had a use. It turns out it did. And then there's the part of her story that I think about most. After everything, after the bar, after the tray, after she sat in Lucien's office and laid out 6 weeks of careful, documented observation, she said something that I think gets at the heart of who she was. She said she didn't come forward sooner because she needed to be right, not just useful. She was willing to hold uncomfortable knowledge in silence for weeks until she was certain. That's not passivity. That's a kind of steadiness that most people never develop, because most people can't tolerate uncertainty long enough to let it resolve honestly. What happens to a person like that eventually is what happened to Clover. The world caught up to what she'd always been, not because someone handed her anything, but because she had kept showing up, quietly, precisely, without asking for acknowledgement, until the evidence of her value became impossible for even the most inattentive room to ignore. I think about the 12-year-old in the cafeteria in Sudbury. I think about what she would make of that Thursday night in Montreal, of Lucien standing in front of his people and saying her name like it meant something, like she was someone who had always mattered and the room had simply been slow to notice. They were